Should we wait about about 3 more minutes?
Yeah, it's only 2:58, so give everyone a couple more minutes.
All right.
This is Kate. Can you hear me? Okay.
And I should test my mic as well. This is Kathy. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Right. Thanks.
Hey, Jim, Scott Irwin can't make it today. He had to bow out last minute. So just so you know.
Who did?
Scott Irwin.
Oh, he bowed out?
Yeah, so he had a conflict come up. So just FYI.
Well, I appreciate that. Well, it's going to be fun to see some of the planning commission meetings when this all hits them.
Yep.
I wanted to let everyone know that we are streaming right now, and as soon as we get the meeting started, I'll start recording.
Okay,
Oh,
thank
perfect.
you. Hi, JJ.
Hello.
Hello, Greg. I'll get started in about another minute. Now let's go ahead and get started on it anyway. And I'll start off with introductions. And Kathy, do you want to go ahead first?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, this is Kathy Corliss. I'm a principal with MIG APG and working with the city staff on this project.
Charlie?
Charlie Matthews. Hi.
And who are you representing, Charlie?
Planning Commission.
Thank you. Harlan?
I'm Harlan Barrow with Icon Construction. I'm part of the development community, filling in for Darren Gustor.
Greg? You're muted, Greg.
Greg DiLoretto with the Transportation Advisory Board.
John?
Yes, I am John Floyd with the City of West Linn Planning Department.
Kate?
Hello, Kate Rogers. I'm a senior planner with MIG APG, working with Kathy and city staff on the project.
JJ?
JJ Portlock with Toll Brothers, part of the development community.
Tom?
Tom Watton, Historical Review Board.
Vicky?
Community citizen involvement.
Darren?
Darren Wise, planning manager with the city of West Linn.
Kim, are you still on or have you left?
No, I'm here. Kim Bria, Sustainability Advisory Board.
And I'm Jim Farrell, a citizen at large. So, okay. Darren, why don't you go ahead and just give a real quick role of the working group and our purpose and our meeting guidelines.
All right, thanks, Jim. All right, so as we've done every meeting, just remind everyone of the role of the working group. You've successfully gotten through 2 of your 3 projects, so this is the 3rd and final one. The intent is to try to get a recommendation from the group today on the Clear and Objective Standards project. So we'll work to achieve a consensus today on this group of amendments. The meeting guidelines are also attached. Again, these meeting guidelines we agreed to back in February, I believe it was. Again, if we can't find consensus and we need to go to a vote, that's what we will do with the group. So with that, I will move on to the next agenda item. Jim.
Okay, we're gonna do the, Darren's gonna handle the summary of the notes and then the September meeting discussion recap and see how, if anybody has any problems with anything that is in it. Darren, go ahead. And hi, Shannon Knight, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, hi, Shannon Knight. I'm representing CCI and EDC.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thanks. All right, so the September meeting summary notes were included in the packet. So if anyone has any requested changes to the notes, please let us know now, and then we can get those changes made.
Okay, does anybody have anything they want to add or subtract from it? Seeing none, let's move on then.
Okay. All right, and then I'm just going to give a quick recap of the last meeting. I'm not sure if John was going to do the same in his presentation or not, but so as if you remember, the previous meeting was primarily focused on Community Development Code Chapter 2, which is definitions, and Chapter 55, which is design review. One of the major components of it was the consultant team had split Chapter 55, and they've done the same with Chapter 85, which you'll see today, into a clear and objective tract for housing, and then an alternative discretionary tract, which is basically our code now. So it would give an applicant the option to go strictly the clear and objective tract or go into the discretionary tract. And again, you'll see this today. John and Kathy and Kate will get into this. So again, the last meeting it was expressed a number of times, and so I'll say it again here, and then I'm sure John and Kate and Kathy will say the same thing. This is truly trying to just get the code clear and objective and not getting in any policy decision making. So just taking the code as it exists and trying to make it clear and objective. If the group does have ideas about policy changes, we can always include those into the recommendation that gets passed on to the Planning Commission for the council to direct us to look into it at some point in the future. So that's just a quick recap of the last meeting. The group did not request any substantial changes at the last meeting, and it seemed that the group expressed that since there were no policy decisions being made, that the consultant team and John had done a pretty good job of creating language that was clear and objective. And I will stop there, Mr. Chair.
All right, well, we're going to go to the clear and objective code compliance project discussion number 3. And I'm going to leave it to John to take it from there.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint here, and since I can't see the screen while I have it pulled up, just feel free to pipe up and interrupt me if you have a question while I'm going along. So give me 1 second. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my screen there. Again, this is meeting 9 of the working group, and it's our 3rd meeting on the clear and objective code compliance project. So, and I want to thank Darren for his overview of the last meeting on that. So I think in terms of how we structured, I just want to touch on some major points here. Darren gave a good recap of the last meeting, and I'll touch on a few key themes of that as well. I then plan on giving a pretty high level summary of package number 2. It's really focused on subdivision standards, public improvements, and a few other related code sections scattered throughout the code that were not addressed last time. We also received a number of comments ahead of time, which was really appreciated as well from Greg and Shannon, and so I'll be touching on those. And then I think from there we'll follow on into questions and discussion. I think last time we just sort of opened it up to chapter by chapter, so I think that structure probably works best this time, and I'll let the chair handle that. And then at the end, if everyone's feeling comfortable, perhaps we can make a consensus recommendation, but we'll make that decision once we're at the end of the meeting. So just moving on, just as a reminder, we're doing this project to comply with state requirements. Standards for housing have to be clear and objective. And again, as Darren mentioned, our goal is as content neutral and updated to the CDC as possible. I mean, that's our, there are a few sections where we've had to do some interpretation deletion, but really our end goal is a conversion of existing standards to clear and objective without any policy changes. And again, just as a reminder, there are different ways of getting to clear and objective, such as true false statements, ratios, counts and measurements, or lists and menus. Sorry, and you'll see examples of all these in the package before you today. So I think the one sort of follow-up chapter from last time was chapter 2, and again here I just intend to go over a summary of each affected chapter in your packet today. So there were about half dozen definition changes since the last meeting. A few of them were minor changes based on feedback received at the last meeting, such as building elevation, garage, grade, definition of local street, for example, which we revised to better align with the transportation system plan. Some of the new definitions today relate to manufactured homes, manufactured dwellings, and manufactured dwelling parks, and that was really done to comply with state statutes, really to align our code with state code. And that's sort of the background behind that. But otherwise, chapter 2 is largely unchanged from when we presented it at the last meeting. So the first new chapter in your packet is, or not, I shouldn't say new, but updated chapter is chapter 24, which is planned unit developments. This is generally a discretionary chapter. It's optional. It's something applicants can opt into, but we're having to change it for a couple of reasons. First is that there's some really confusing legacy language in chapter 24.070. And really this section sort of talks about when a PUD is not required. And it's pretty confusing to readers of the code because we're not really sure of its overall intent. Really, this is sort of remnant language from a time from when planned unit developments were actually mandatory in certain circumstances. About 6 or 7 years ago, council removed some language related to mandatory PUDs, and this section appears to be a remnant from that time that wasn't pulled out. So we are recommending a removal of this section to make the chapter easier to read, and we believe this change is consistent with council direction provided in Ordinance 1647. I think also too, and the second part resulted in a lot of discussion with us and the consultant team and the city attorney, is that in the planned unit development chapter, through a PUD, you can actually implement uses not allowed in the underlying zone. So for example, through a PUD, you could apply for multifamily housing in a commercial zone where it's not otherwise allowed. However, because a PUD is a discretionary permit process for approval, and housing must have a clear and objective path, we can't actually retain this within the PUD chapter and still be compliant with a clear and objective requirement. So we are proposing removal of residential uses as additional allowed uses within the PUD. If I need to restate this to make it clear, I can certainly do that. But basically, we are proposing removing this from the PUD chapter. So I think moving on, chapter 34, accessory structures, and the changes to this chapter are limited to section 030, which is accessory dwelling units. As I mentioned in an email on Monday, and as some of you already know, the Planning Commission is taking up a separate parallel project to do a sort of policy examination of accessory dwelling units, and in terms of when they're allowed, how they're allowed, things like that. So the changes here in this package are pretty conservative, and essentially they're limited to three things. One is that we're clarifying that ADUs or accessory dwelling units are only allowed with a single family detached dwelling and not with a duplex, triplex, fourplex. And this matter is being taken up in parallel with the Planning Commission to see if it should be expanded. But basically, in the package before you, we're taking a conservative approach in terms of clarifying the section specifying where and when ADUs are allowed. The proposed changes also remove the off-street parking requirement for ADUs. Currently, one space is required in our code. However, we've been precluded by the state from actually requiring that. And there's an ORS citation on the screen there. Essentially, the standard's unenforceable right now. And so we're just proposing to remove it since we can't apply it. And then third, there are a number of design standards which are discretionary in nature, relating to things like exterior materials, window placement, and their attention to privacy of adjoining neighbors, and roof design. And these standards are discretionary and rely upon a lot of subjective judgment by planning staff and the applicant. And so we are proposing their removal at this time because, again, relying upon this parallel project with the Planning Commission to address these matters. So third chapter here is chapter 36, manufactured homes. These changes are largely intended to comply with state requirements. So we are aligning the code with ORS 197 and 446 in regards to manufactured dwelling parks in terms of things like minimum size requirements. For example, our current code requires a minimum of 2 acres for a manufactured dwelling park, and the state requirement says no more than 1 acre for a minimum. So we're just making a modification there. We're also doing amendments necessary to comply with House Bill 4064, which was adopted earlier this year. And it basically says we can't apply a standard to a manufactured home that's not also applied to a site-built dwelling. There are a few exceptions to that. I believe energy compliance, energy envelopes may be one, but essentially because of this new requirement, a number of the design standards within the code regarding things like eaves and exterior building materials need to be removed to comply with state requirements. Also, too, we also inserted language increasing the linkage between the public works, between the requirements for manufactured dwelling parks and the public works design standards. And so right now the standards are somewhat discretionary as for the internal street improvements and other improvements required for manufactured dwelling parks. And the changes would it would make them more clear and objective by more clearly referencing the public works design standards in terms of interior improvements there. So the next couple chapters are pretty minor updates here. Chapters 41 and 43, which regard building height and then side yard transitions. These are largely just clarifications and sort of and reconciliation of inconsistent language between sections, and they're just intended to remove ambiguity. I think also things to and also clarify when these standards apply as well. So just trying to make clear and objective thresholds of review. And again, nothing major in there. The next chapter is affected chapters off-street parking. And again, at the top of my screen, I've included page numbers in case people want to reference those as I'm talking. We can come back to these slides later as well. Again, most of the changes here are just minor text clarifications. There are a few notable changes in there. One is that there was some language in there which we just couldn't easily convert to clear and objective. And so residential development was exempted from those standards. We also, again, strengthened references to the Public Works design standards, and we also replaced subjective language regarding lighting standards with more clear and objective standards, including an exhibit to try and make that more legible and enforceable. So next chapter is chapter 48, which is access and circulation. This chapter has a lot of small amendments in there because the language is highly discretionary in there, and so to the degree possible, we clarified, but the core of this chapter going forward is a reliance on clear and objective spacing and design standards, and to allow exceptions through a discretionary review process where the standards could not be met. Also, as before, we increased our strengthened our references to the TSP and the Public Works design standards, and we also formalized the requirement for a TVF&R service provider permit. Pretty sure we talked about this at the last meeting. This is essentially it's a pre-review by TVF&R to make sure that any proposal complies with fire code requirements as interpreted by TVF&R. And so this is something a lot of jurisdictions are already doing. We're just putting it in the code to make it more enforceable from that process as well. I think one thing I do want to sort of pause here in this is that prior to the meeting, the chair had asked me a question about where we require properties to access on a lower street on the lower street classification. If, for example, you have a corner lot that has a collector and a local street, and on page 148 is where you can find that requirement. And so I can give you a more specific reference, Chair, but there is an existing requirement for lots with multiple frontages to take access from the lower classification street, and we're not changing that requirement. So I'm not going to address that in more detail later if you'd like. So. Okay, conditional use chapter remains largely unchanged. The one exception here is that we are relocating some language out of the definitions chapter into this chapter. We also did this with the subdivision chapter and the design review chapter 55 and 85 chapters. And essentially what we're doing is relocating an approval criteria out of the definitions chapter where it can be hidden, it's not easily found, and we're removing the language and we're moving it into the conditional use approval criteria. So, and again, that's in section 60.070A4. I also received a question ahead of this meeting about concern about this language being removed from the definition of adequate public facilities, and this is one of the locations where it's being transferred. So again, in terms of this, we're not, the project is, the goal of the project is a content neutral change, and so we are maintaining this this standard. And again, I can go into greater detail if anyone wants to talk about this. So chapter 85 is really where the working group is going to see the most changes in the code. This was really the core of package 2. And so in addition to a generalized update of terminology to make it more clear and objective, there are a few other things as well. One big change which touched this section as well as chapter 91 is that House Bill 2306 requires cities to issue building permits prior to the recording of a final plat, provided certain specified conditions are met. And so this includes certain certain waypoints be met. So for example, completion of a water system, fire hydrants, stormwater systems, and their testing, as well as provision of a financial guarantee. And so we've actually incorporated changes into the chapters 85 and 91 to make sure that we're compliant with House Bill 2306 on that. I think the other big change you're going to see is that our existing transportation impact analysis requirements are fairly discretionary, and I think Shannon, if you're trying to speak right now, I think you're muted. So, so our solution here for the TIA requirements is to create a 2-track system, such as we did in other parts of the code. And so we created a residential versus a non-residential / discretionary track. And this was upon strong encouragement of the city attorney. And so again, we tried to hold as close as possible to the existing requirements, and so including the maintenance of the current threshold of 250 average daily trips for when a TIA is required.
I think, John, can I come in here, or is this where you want to discuss what we discussed yesterday?
If you want to, or again, if I can, I'm almost done. I'm almost finished with my presentation.
We'll come back to it. Go ahead.
That sounds great. Thank you, Chair. So, so I think also other changes in Chapter 85. Again, we're formalizing the requirement for a TVFNR service provider permit. We're also, one of the things we did is that a lot of this chapter is pretty lengthy, and it's very it's almost narrative in format. It's very descriptive in terms of the intent of the chapter, and rather than completely strike it out, we tried to retain somewhere possible as purpose statements to maintain the continuity of intent of prior council decisions on this. I think other changes we did, we clarified language relating to street extensions, mandatory street connections, and cul-de-sacs in terms of when they're required and when they're exempted from these requirements. And again, also just more clearly linking standards and criteria to the TSP and Public Works design standards. And so Chapter 91, again, this was another chapter where we had to insert some language to comply with House Bill 2306, which requires cities to issue building permits prior to final plat recordation under certain circumstances. And this is the chapter that regulates improvement guarantees on that. And then finally, actually, this is second to last. Sorry. Chapter 92 covers required improvements for subdivisions. And again, changes here were largely converting subjective and clear language to clear and objective terminology. You'll see common themes here: strengthening references to the TSP and Public Works design standards, and removal of some outdated language regarding street classifications. And then finally, last affected chapter is Chapter 99. This is procedures for quasi-judicial applications. At multiple points in the code allows the planning director to ask for additional information if required to show compliance with certain approval criteria. And you may recall from the city attorney's past presentations is that we're allowed to do that provided we inform the applicant of this additional requirement ahead of the application, either as part of a pre-application meeting or otherwise communicated to the applicant in cases where a pre-app meeting is not required, or may occur after the pre-application meeting. So that's it. Again, that's a fairly high level summary of all the changes, and we can certainly dive into chapters where you have questions. We did receive a number of comments from working group members, including Shannon Knight and Greg DiLoretto. I responded to most of those on Monday in the email. One thing I wanted to call out, I'd like to make one modification to the staff response that went out on Monday, is that in terms of looking at the comments further, our consultant recommended one slight modification on page 150, section B3, and this regards the maximum grade allowed for a driveway. And so Originally, we were looking to improve this language um, by modifying a sentence that says, regardless, the last 18 feet in front of the garage shall be under 12% grade as measured, et cetera, et cetera. We wanted to say even with approval of a variance, but Shannon Knight suggested that our proposed language was not as clear as it could be. So we're actually proposing revised language for the section that we believe more clearly establishes 18 feet I'm sorry, a 12% grade as mandatory in all situations. It can't be waived through a variance. So through the language on the screen here. And this might be better discussed with the full chapter in context, but I just wanted to revise our recommendation here. And really, that's about it in terms of that. I think going forward, last time we just sort of went chapter by chapter, and that seemed to work for the group. I recommend maybe we approach it that way, unless people want to jump to specific chapters. In making your comments, we just ask that people reference the page number so everyone can follow, and that we perhaps prioritize topics requiring group deliberation as well. So if they're minor capitalizations and minor grammar issues, you can just email us separately. So so I think with that, I'll just turn this over to you, Chair, and we can go forward. So.
Okay, well, thanks, John. Does anybody have any questions on any of the chapters, the earlier ones, or would you like to cover? I see no hands up. I have one thing myself, but is there anybody else first? Okay, I think John and the consultants have done a good job basically throughout this. But John, I still have that problem on page 202, and it's the 85.170. And if you go to first of all, it's C, and under the Transportation Engineers Trip Generations Manual, 5th edition, things changed drastically, and they could have a 6th edition out tomorrow or the next, or a year or two from now. And we'd have to go back in and redo to make it clear and objective that this is actually, we're going with number 6 instead of number 5. Shannon, you have something to say with that?
No, I was just not in that particular thing, so you can finish.
Okay. Anybody have it? What do you think about that? It's keeping things so we don't have to continue to revisit.
Yeah.
So are you saying, Jim, we just substitute the words trip generation be determined by using the latest edition of the Institute of Transportation Engineers Trip Generation Manual?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
If I might jump in, we included this language specifically based on direction from the city attorney about being specific about the versions and editions that we were relying on. I know it's really frustrating. Traditionally, it was always as amended, or we had language like that. And we will ask again, because I do agree with you, for simplicity's sake in the future, we would certainly like to be able to rely and not have, on the versions as they change and not have to amend the code every time. Absolutely agree with you on the practicality of that. If we can do it, we will. Our understanding was we needed to be specific, which is why we wrote it to be specific, but we will check again. Yeah.
Thank you, Kathy. Greg?
Well, the only thing I wouldn't understand, Kathy, would be, I assume there's someplace else in the code that says all this stuff applies at the time you apply for a permit or something. So you wouldn't get caught with one edition and then you're halfway through and you now have to comply with the second. So there's someplace else where you talk about when this stuff applies, right?
Yes, I mean, you're always there's state requirements related to what they call vesting about when you apply and when you're coming, all of those things. So certainly that tells you what version of the code. The question was more about, is a code clear and objective if it isn't specific to the source document with regard to the version? And it is a little bit of a different question, obviously what you adopt in the code. So again, I think I really appreciate the comment. I think we all agree with the sentiment. And if we can get it, if we can fix that, we will. And if not, then it's just going to be a maintenance issue of, annually the city's going to need to go in and do cleanup amendments to bring it up to date. If there are sections like that that go out of date. I hope not. I mean, I'd rather not, but we had understood that it needed to be specific. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
I'm going to let Shannon go before I bring my next one up too.
Yeah, I mean, I brought that up about referencing the 2016 CSD too, for that same reason that that's going to get updated at some point. So, yeah, I just had, and John said I sent some clarifying stuff, my questions earlier, so about the ADU and basically how it relates to HB 2001, where a single family home is the same as a duplex, the same as a triplex, but why you can't do an ADU if it's a duplex when it's the same thing as a single family home under HB 2001.
So Darren, did you want to address that?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. I think calling something a duplex or an ADU is only really relevant in two situations. One being we're proposing to exempt ADUs from having to install street improvements. So that would be the one case. And then secondly, so if a property owner or developer wants to do a middle housing project, which is House Bill 2001, and then split it into individual lots under Senate Bill 458, which again, this is sort of getting outside of the scope of this project, but the Senate Bill 458 is very clear that you can only have one resulting dwelling unit on a property. So if you wanted to split the, so yeah, it's very complex, but if you wanted to build a duplex with two ADUs and then split those into individual duplexes with an ADU, you could not do it under Senate Bill 458. You would have to do it under a regular subdivision or partition process. So that would.
Yeah, but if you're not splitting the lot, like if you're just converting like a lower level to a duplex, and then so you can't add an ADU. It's just, this is my problem I had earlier when we did the HB 2001, is that we have no definition for a single family home. So in that definition now, the way the code reads, it reads that, a single family dwelling, the only place you can add an ADU is a single family dwelling, but the definition of a single family dwelling is that it says is also considered a duplex, triplex, quadplex because of the definition.
Yes, I see Kate has her hand up, but yeah, so you could, yeah, then it would just be considered a triplex or a quadplex at that point.
Go ahead, Kate.
Thanks. Yeah. And I definitely understand the concern. And I think the intent of adding in the ADU chapter saying, ADUs are allowed with a single family dwelling, excluding duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes, was just to kind of go back to the sort of original intent of the code before the changes were made under HB 2001. And under state law, cities are only required to allow an ADU with a single family detached dwelling. Cities, of course, have the option of allowing ADUs with, say, a duplex, but they're not required to do that. And the HB 2001 kind of rulemaking process really made that clear. So yeah, this is just
but our definition, again, the definition, we need a definition of a single family dwelling, because the definition of a single family dwelling is a duplex.
Right. Understood. Yeah. So I think that the intent of that is to say all single family dwellings can have a duplex except all single family dwellings can have an ADU except for duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes. There may be a way to state that a little bit more clearly, so there's no confusion at all. But yeah, that was.
Well, my thing with the whole HB 2001 is that you need a definition first, and I was told you can't have a definition for single family dwelling, and I was like, well, there are cases, and this is one of those cases where it is literally only a single family dwelling, but we have no definition for a single family dwelling.
JJ would like to.
Well, it seems like it could be handled through the land use. Like, in other words, you can't have a duplex on a child lot that has an ADU. But you can have a duplex on a lot that has an ADU, because it's really the land division part of the Senate Bill 458 that limits your ADUs, right? So you can have a duplex on a lot with an ADU. That is allowed, assuming 458, right? So if the code was written that if a duplex is on a child lot, it cannot have an ADU. Does that make sense, Darren?
Yeah, or so you're saying like it's like a new construction or something like that.
If you don't partition the land through Senate Bill 458, let's say you build a duplex or you convert your home to a duplex, you're still on one single lot. So therefore you can have an ADU. As soon as you partition that or do the land use through the Senate Bill 458, you've created two lots, and now you have two child lots that won't allow an ADU. That to me is how you can define when an ADU can be built in conjunction with a duplex.
Yeah, I think that would be a lot clearer. Because if my example that I gave, let's say I convert my basement, which is a living daylight basement, into a duplex, that means I couldn't then change my garage, which is a detached garage, into an ADU the way the code reads right now. But it's all on one lot and I'm not doing any land division.
Arguably, you could just call that a triplex, though.
Correct.
That's what I was going to say, is that in that case, you could have that third unit, but it would just have to be defined as a triplex.
But even though it's under, 500 square feet or whatever?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, that's where I was just confused by the way it said, because it looks like I can't do what I want on my property because it says that you can't have a duplex with an ADU.
Yeah, and I do think cleaning it up on the child lot is probably a good idea, though. If that's the intent of the city, is not to have an ADU on a lot that's been subdivided through the 458 process, it should be clear that ADUs are not allowed on child lots, and then that handles it, doesn't it? Because in no circumstance can you do an ADU on a child lot. Is that a fair statement?
That is correct.
So that's the only exception to an ADU would be when you're trying to do it on a child lot. Otherwise, it would be allowed. Is that correct?
Yes, just as you said, it could be, we would just consider it a triplex or a quadplex at that point. The way the code is being written.
Because Darren, there are cities that are addressing this. Some of them are allowing it. So I think it needs to be clear from the development community standpoint, what's the code in West Linn? And if you do a land use through Senate Bill 458, you're not allowed to then have an ADU on that child lot. I think it's important to clarify that.
Okay. Anybody want to add to that?
I think perhaps. Go ahead,
John.
Kate. No, go ahead.
I got a little bit confused with when the Senate Bill 458 discussion came up, because I think that Shannon's original comment was the code does not adequately clarify, or it creates some confusion by defining all of these things as single family dwellings, but then precluding ADUs on, plex lots. But the question of ADUs on child lots is kind of a separate question. I mean, that's something that is, cities are allowed to prohibit that as part of the Senate Bill 458 legislation. I don't know whether that was codified in the city of West Linn's code or whether it's just the state rules kind of apply directly to an application. But It's not the same thing as whether a city allows an ADU with just a duplex on one lot.
Right, so but that's the question, is the city does allow an ADU on a duplex on a single lot. What the city, is that not the case? I thought that was what Darren had said, just not in conjunction with 458. Because right now, if there's a duplex out there that exists on a single lot, one could do an ADU, could they not?
I don't believe that is the intent of the code. It may be that the code can be interpreted in that way, but my understanding is that the original intent of the code was an ADU is allowed with one single family
Yeah,
dwelling, and that it wasn't adequately clarified as part of the HB 2001 process that allowance was not expanded to middle housing types.
Yeah, if you go to page
correct.
83 of the packet is where the language is at.
Yeah.
Yeah, it allows an ADU in conjunction with a primary single-family dwelling. Yeah, there it is. And then to address Shannon's question, the language about excluding duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes was being proposed to be added there.
But yeah, again, the definition of a single family dwelling is a duplex, triplex, or quadplex.
Shannon, would it help if that were reworded to say single family detached dwelling except for duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes? Is that any clearer, or is it the same problem?
No, like I said, my problem is that the definition of a single family detached dwelling is also a duplex, triplex, or quadplex. So you're saying, existing primary single family dwelling, which is the same thing as a duplex, triplex, quadplex, but then saying excluding duplex, triplex,
Right.
quadplex.
It's
Does that make sense?
the standard, I think, Shannon, is trying to create a subset of the thing which is defined as a single family dwelling, right? So the standard is saying, look, we know there's a definition of single family dwelling, and we're talking about allowing accessory dwelling units only for a subset of that definition. And so I think what we're trying to do here is express how do you express that subset, right? So the subset of all things that are single family dwellings, the subset that can have an accessory dwelling unit are those single family dwellings that are detached and are not duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes. So I think that's how best to express that, to be really clear about it. And again, whether maybe that's the broader conversation for the ADU group, maybe is that a good idea or not? But I think what we were trying to do is express that subset.
Okay, but that's my problem, is it's not a subset in the definition.
It's
also being defined as.
I understand. And so what we're saying here is, here's that definition of single family dwelling. Of that definition, in this standard where we're speaking specifically to what can have an ADU, we want to say not everything that's defined as a single family dwelling can have an ADU. Only some of those things that are defined as single family dwellings can have ADUs.
I understand that, but that's not how the definition is written. So maybe the definition needs to change to say this can include, which is what I asked for originally with HB 2001, is which can include a duplex, triplex, quadplex. It says it's defined as, meaning they're all equal, right? Maybe further defined as a duplex instead of saying this can include.
Yes, you're right. I mean, that would might help. I can understand where you're going with that. Maybe let us look at that a little bit more closely with staff and see if there's a solution. But I guess the bottom line is the ADU section substantively is trying to be clear about the subset. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understood that that's what it was doing.
Okay.
I understood the intent of the code. But I feel there's a conflict with the definition of what a single family home is.
I see what you're saying. I can see your point. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, because otherwise someone could just say my duplex is a single family home, so therefore I can have an ADU. And they say, well, no, that's not that's yours is a duplex. Like, well, it's not because it's defined as a single family dwelling. So that's great.
So what is the group's consensus here? Do we want to accept what we have here or request that the consultants work with staff to come up with something a little better? Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I have a question is, if we don't have, if it's not real clear, can the city be sued? Will this end up in court? I mean, will it cost us money? I mean, what are we looking at here?
This is Kate. I'll attempt to answer that.
Kate, go for it.
I think if it were somehow not clear that an ADU was not permitted, say with a duplex, you could imagine a developer coming in and saying, I want to build an ADU on my duplex. The code is not clear and objective in how it regulates the permission for an ADU. Therefore, you cannot apply that standard and you can't preclude me from building my ADU. I'm not sure if that would actually work, but maybe that's the risk. I think with the change as proposed in this ADU chapter, I think the city would be covered in that situation. But I think addressing Shannon's concern about how single family dwelling is defined would be kind of a general improvement to the code potentially.
Greg, you want to add to that?
No, I mean, to me, it's clear, but it's not clear to some people, and that is exactly what will happen when we try to apply the code.
But because of the new House Bill 2001, honestly, it's irrelevant because someone would then just say, you can't do an ADU. And I would just say, okay, it's a duplex. Okay, it's a third of my triplex.
Right, but we say right there, excluding duplex, triplex.
No, I get what I'm saying is I would, the ADU would be called, I would not call it an ADU.
Correct. Yeah.
Well, then you call it a triplex.
I would call it a triplex.
Which would be fine because then you'd have to add parking. Once it's not an ADU anymore, it now requires the parking standards, which was my issue in the comments that I sent, which we can't require parking for ADUs. But if you call it a triplex, you get to put in that extra parking.
Well, I didn't catch that. So now I want to revise the code because I don't want to add parking.
It's only one space.
Okay, I'm going to add one more little thing to that. An ADU, if I understand it correctly, has to have cooking facilities, bath facilities, running water, the whole bit, right?
Correct.
And so if you do put it on a duplex, it becomes a triplex. Regardless of the size, if it's 500 square feet or 900 square feet, it makes no matter. It's still going to be a triplex or a quadplex, depending on what you put it up. And if you have a single, it's originally set up for the single family home, one house. And if you have a duplex or try to make a duplex and add that, then you have a triplex. Yeah. So anyway, that's my 3 cents worth. Anybody else? Okay. How about anybody else on any other issues?
One thing as the parking got brought up, is it defined when it says for 2 off-street parking? Is that size defined?
It is, yes, already.
Okay.
And so the size requirements aren't changing. So they're,
Okay, anybody else? I have one other thing if nobody else has, and if we go back to page 202, and this is the, go down to 6A and B, and it's saying like 250 average car trips per day is for like a 25 unit development. Examples that I saw when I was on the planning commission was the Upper Mid Hill Road, where you have 34 units supposedly going in at the end of Upper Mid Hill, and the only access exit is through either Arbor, which is a very narrow street, or Upper Mid Hill going all the way through to Merrillhurst to catch the light. And that whole street on Upper Mid Hill has a park on it. It has families, small kids and whatnot. And I'm just trying to understand why we just can't have, if you're going to have a development of over 10 houses, then you need to have a traffic analysis, because that, we've read against this time and time again. Another case was over by Bland Circle, trying to put the street right out onto Salamo, and the lawyer was saying that it's a class, it's a class 1 or class A intersection, when in fact it wasn't classified at all. It was class F. And so I see here, unless this is someplace else in the code where it says 250 average trips per day, this is adding to the code.
Yeah.
And instead of making it clear and objective.
So if I could jump in here, Chair, to address your comment, unless you have more to say about this, I apologize if I'm cutting you off. Yeah, so this is a situation where we created a 2-track system where non-residential development maintains the current standards, and we've created a new clear and objective track for residential development here. This is based in part on, to the degree possible, on the existing standards. So this language here is reflected further up. Where is it? Let's see here. Under the existing standards of 250 average daily trips. And this is the current traffic impact analysis standards and thresholds. So we're just trying to keep a sort of threshold neutral status here. So we're not trying to argue 250 is appropriate necessarily. It's just this is where the bar is pegged right now, and we're trying to maintain that. And so that's how we got to this number. So
yeah, it doesn't make sense to me if you have a established community such as you have in Upper Mid Hill, and also along Bland Circle and whatnot, and you got streets in there are narrower than the 28 foot streets that we have now, and a lot of them don't even have sidewalks on them. And in order to make this thing work throughout the city, you're going to have to go through each street on the city to make sure that it'll take the 250 to get it into a study of some kind. Whether if you put it 10, which you can almost put into anywhere, you can put 10 which is 100 trips per day easily. But when you get up to the 25 and on up, you've got problems. It's all going to come downhill. So Kathy, you apparently want to say something about it. Your hands.
I didn't mean to interrupt you at all. I just was going to say that the other advantage to something like the 250 average daily trips is actually that it is housing type neutral. So if we say 10 dwelling units, or it raises the question about middle housing and some of the things where we were trying to be neutral about that, and overall in HB 2001. So I think that using a measure of trips is actually a little bit more neutral in that account. So just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but even under the 2001 and 3, they can put more units in these areas that are going to be developed if they were to wish to. And so you're faced with, I don't think we need to have 250 as an average trip per day before you trip in a traffic analysis. I think anything over 10 deserves at least to look at, because of all the conversion streets where you got one to let Greg and then Darren.
Well, no, I don't have anything to help you with there, Jim. The fact is, our job wasn't to look at the code in terms of that. You may be absolutely right, but we would need to do that was something outside of the scope of our work, was whether we changed the existing code. And you may be absolutely right. So I don't really help you any, but that really wasn't what we were supposed to be looking at. And before we get to that point, on the Transportation Advisory Board, I'd want to do a whole study of whether or not 250 or 100 or 5 or whatever is the correct number. So I don't think we're at a point where we could do that, and we weren't charged with doing that.
Okay, well, I just happened to see it on here as it looked like an addition to the code instead of going back and not knowing exactly where we have it codified. And I don't believe it still is codified, is it, Darren?
Yeah, if you look at page 201, that's where it comes from. It's just, again, that's where it exists currently. And that's the discretionary track that John and consultant team have come up with or left, and then created the clear and objective tract and just transferred that 250 down to the clear and objective tract on page 202. So yeah, it's already there. It's just being transferred to the clear and objective tract.
Well, I'll let that one slide. Let that planning commission take care of that one, and they will. Yeah, I see Charlie shaking his head, so that one. So that I'll leave that one to the planning commission. Anybody else? Any public comment? Lynn? Lynn Schroeder, do we have any public comment?
Yeah, I do. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Lynn.
I don't have any public comment.
No,
mean,
we
I
don't have
anyone.
anybody signed up, Chair.
Yeah.
That's kind of going fast. Does anybody else have anything you want to say? I think we can probably wrap this up. Well, okay. Any feedback to the staff or the consultants that you want to give? Darren?
Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, if there's no more discussion around the proposed code amendment package, I would like to get to a consensus of the group that everyone agrees to push this forward. And if there's any recommendations for things to maybe tackle at the planning commission level that is outside of the scope of this group, include that in the recommendation so we can get a formal recommendation together to package this up, take to the planning commission.
First, let's hear from Kim and then Charlie.
I have to say thank you so much to staff and to the consultants because this is a heavy lift. There was a lot of details to iron out and you made this big job easier. So huge thanks.
Charlie?
I want to copy that too. You guys have done an outstanding job. But in this instance, Darren, I'm going to have to abstain. I think there are too many issues here that are kind of key to the planning commission's hearing. So, I mean, we can call it a consensus if you want, because I'm not voting against anything, but then I'm not going to vote for anything in this particular instance.
Okay, anybody else? Well, folks, I appreciate all the time and the effort that you've all put into it and for showing up at these impromptu meetings once a month for the last almost a year, I guess. So thank you very much for your service. Appreciate it. Anything else, Darren, before I close it up, or John?
Yeah, so I would just say, yeah, trying to get consensus here. So
excuse me.
Everyone okay with the proposing this code package going forward, except Mr. Matthews, who won't endorse it?
And won't unendorse it either.
I'm going to stay with Charlie on that. I'll abstain on this one. So it looks like is there anybody against it? I see nobody against it. So there you go.
Okay, and then just for clarifications, I think in the consensus here, my sense of the group feels strongly about the versioning of citations. That's something you wanted to include in terms of us staff pushing to include as amended or as updated or things like that language.
Could you push it? Could you push it through after you're done and just send us a quick memo or letter what you've done?
Yes, absolutely.
An email to kind of clean this thing up.
Mm-hmm.
Does that work for everybody?
That'd be very helpful.
Okay. Well, folks, it's been nice working with you.
All right, well, I have one more thing, Jim.
Oh, I don't know, Darren, if I got time for it.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, so I can't remember. It's agenda item 6, I guess. So yeah, just appreciate everyone's time volunteering on this committee. I know it's a big commitment. 2 hours, 9 different times. And the city council staff takes your time in consideration, and we really appreciate it. We want to be as efficient and effective when people volunteer their time. So I'll send out a follow-up email to the group. So if you have any suggestions about how meetings like this could be run more efficiently, effectively, or different types of materials that would help you get through decision-making processes, that would be great feedback for us. But at this point in time, since we're all still here, just give you the opportunity if you want to discuss as a group any idea, any things that worked or things that didn't work through this process. Be glad to hear it now. Otherwise, again, I'll send an email for feedback from you there. I appreciate the kind words from Kim and Charlie about the John and the consultant team doing a great job, which they did. Huge lift. Kate and Kathy poured through that code, and then John reviewed it. A lot of time was spent on this, so it was a great effort. So again, if anyone has any feedback right now, be happy to hear it. Otherwise, I'll send that email out.
It says thunders when there's just a couple things that were just needed to be discussed or felt to need to be discussed when he got right down to it. Shannon wants to say something. Shannon with an
I
E.
just want to say thank you to staff and the consultants. I was very exhausted after reading all the code. So going through it line by line must have been, I only scrolled through the highlighted part. So I thought this was a really good working group. I know it's a little harder to do on Zoom, but I think it's easier for people, and I think it ended up working out. So good job.
Kim?
Okay, kidding, not kidding. I don't know how, Darren, I don't know how big a Gantt chart would be at the planning desk when people come in, if this, then that. But if there's a visual opportunity, like seriously, if there's a visual opportunity online, to back up the code, it'd be kind of awesome.
I got one real quick.
And thank you, Jim, too, for chairing.
Thank you. Appreciate it. One quick question, just kind of like to get everybody's answer on. Has this been worth it to you?
I haven't been involved until today, but I know that Darren felt this was very productive and really appreciated being involved.
Good. It's been a good group of people to work with. And I thank you all and thank John.